Welcome to Tales of Wild West. The river moved like a living thing beneath the dying light, a slow coil of silver and shadow winding between the cliffs. The sun was sliding behind the rim of the canyon, its glow spilling molten over the water, and the air was thick with the scent of wet stone and sage. He rode along the narrow bank with the quiet patience of a man who had learned not to hurry, the hooves of his horse muffled by the damp earth. There was no sound but the murmur of the current and the low creak of leather as he shifted in the saddle. It was then that he saw it, a scrap of color caught in the reeds where the current pressed against the shore. At first it seemed like a piece of cloth, torn loose and left behind. Then the river shifted, and he saw an arm beneath it, pale against the dark water. The air seemed to thicken in his chest. He was out of the saddle before thought could form, boots sinking into the gravel, hands pulling hard against the drag of the river. She was heavier than he expected, the weight of soaked buckskin clinging to her, hair plastered to her face. He waded backward until his knees struck the shallows, then eased her onto the bank. Her skin was cold, lips parted as if to breathe but finding no air. He pressed his palm against her ribs, felt nothing but the slow seep of water from her clothing. Without a word, he tilted her head back and pressed down, coaxing the river from her lungs. She coughed once, a sharp, small sound, then went still again, eyes closed. He laid her on her side, listening for the faint thread of breath, and only when it came did he let his shoulders ease. Her dress clung close, beadwork glinting faintly in the dim light, the patterns unlike any he had seen except on the few women of the nearby tribe who ventured this far. The sky above the cliffs deepened to violet. He gathered driftwood with quick, efficient movements, struck a match, and nursed the flame until it grew. The firelight painted her face in warm gold, shadows curling beneath her cheekbones. She was young, younger than he had guessed in the water, but there was a strength in the line of her jaw, even in sleep. When her lashes fluttered, he leaned closer. Her eyes opened a fraction, dark and unfocused, finding him with a faint confusion. She murmured something, a few syllables in a language he couldn't follow, then closed them again. The sound carried the rhythm of gratitude, or maybe warning, he couldn't tell which. He sat back on his heels, the fire snapping between them. A thin wind curled along the river, lifting the damp from his shirt. He'd pulled men from danger before, in other seasons of his life, but there was something about this that felt less like rescue and more like interruption, as though the river had been carrying her towards some destiny, and he had stepped between. Her breathing steadied as the hours passed. Once she stirred, turning toward the heat, her hand brushing the ground between them. He noticed the thin leather cord around her wrist, strung with a single turquoise bead. It was worn smooth, as if it had been handled often. Night gathered slow and absolute, swallowing the far banks. He kept the fire alive and his rifle within reach. The tribe whose pattern she wore was known for guarding their own fiercely. If they found her here, with him, there would be questions he didn't know how to answer. Still, he didn't move her. The river's pull had been strong enough to take her once. He wasn't about to give it another chance. By the time the moon crested the canyon, a pale mist rose from the water. She woke again, more fully this time, eyes widening as she took in the fire, the stranger beside her, the unfamiliar bank. Her gaze darted to the water, then back to him. "You were in the river," he said softly, not expecting she'd understand. "You're safe now." She sat up slowly, wincing, pressing a hand to her side. Her voice was quiet but deliberate as she asked something in her own tongue. When he shook his head, she tried again, the words halting. "Why, you help?" He looked at her, surprised by the bluntness of the question. "Because you were drowning," he said simply, and though she might not have caught every word, the tone must have carried, because her shoulders eased. The fire crackled between them. She studied him in silence, as if measuring the space he occupied, the shape of his face beneath the shadow of his hat. He had the feeling she wasn't used to looking at a man this long without being told to stop. When she lay back down, turning toward the flames, he thought she'd sleep again. But her voice came, softer this time. "My people, come!" He nodded. "I figured." There was no more conversation. He kept watch until the edges of the world began to pale, the river taking on the soft silver of morning. Somewhere upstream, the call of a bird split the stillness. It was the drumming of hooves that broke the moment, faint at first, then louder, the sound carrying across the water. He rose, scanning the horizon until he saw them, 3 riders emerging from the canyon's shadow, their horses picking their way along the narrow bank. The woman sat up at once, her eyes fixing on the approaching figures. Relief crossed her face, but so did something else, something he couldn't name, quick as a shadow. She looked at him once, held his gaze for the space of a breath, then pushed herself unsteadily to her feet. The riders reached them, dismounted, and came forward with a rush of words he couldn't follow. They spoke to her first, hands touching her shoulders, their tones shifting between concern and questioning. She answered in short replies, glancing back at him once, briefly. One of the men, older, turned to him. His expression was measured, his eyes scanning from the cowboy's wet clothes to the fire, then to the woman. He said a few words, perhaps thanks, perhaps not, and gestured for her to mount one of their horses. She hesitated only a moment before stepping toward the animal. Yet as she placed her foot in the stirrup, she paused, looking back at him over her shoulder. Her gaze held, steady and unreadable, and in that brief meeting of eyes, he felt an unspoken weight pass between them, something unfinished, something that would not be left here on the bank. Then she swung into the saddle, the riders turned upstream, and the river closed in behind them, carrying away the sound of their departure. He stood alone in the quiet, watching until they were gone, the fire at his feet burning low. The sun lifted over the canyon rim, catching the glint of something in the shallows, a small, smooth turquoise bead, lying where she had been. The morning after the river rescue broke cool and windless, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth. He moved about his ranch with the practiced rhythm of a man who had long since taught himself not to expect interruptions. Yet, somewhere in the back of his thoughts, the memory of her gaze lingered, dark eyes steady against the firelight, the unspoken tether that had passed between them. He told himself it was done now. She was back among her own. Still, his ears caught every distant hoofbeat like a man waiting for news he didn't admit he wanted. By midday, the sound came, faint at first, then distinct, 3 sets of hoofs carrying over the dry grass. He set down his brush, the horse's flank half-curried, and stepped into the open. The figures came into view along the trail, 2 men riding ahead, a woman between them. Even at a distance, the color of her beadwork struck him, catching the sunlight in tiny flashes. They slowed as they reached his gate. One of the men, broad-shouldered and stern, spoke first in the measured tone of someone bridging 2 languages. "She wanted to see you." His voice carried no warmth, but no open hostility either, a fence balanced between them. She dismounted without waiting for help, her movements still stiff from the river's toll. In her hands she carried something wrapped in deerskin. She stepped closer, holding it out with both palms as though it were meant for more than just thanks. He took it carefully, unwrapping the layers to find a small charm, beadwork in blue and white, the pattern symmetrical and deliberate, the threads smelling faintly of smoke. Her voice was soft but sure. "For life," she said, touching her own chest, then gesturing toward him. It was not just gratitude, it was recognition, a quiet binding of memory to object. The men behind her exchanged glances, their posture suggesting impatience. He inclined his head. "I'll keep it," he said, though he wasn't sure if she caught the words. The way her eyes softened told him she understood enough. Before leaving, she glanced around, at the corral, the barn, the long stretch of land reaching toward the low hills. She seemed to drink in the quiet, as though committing it to memory. Then she mounted again, the 3 of them riding back the way they had come, the dust of their passing settling slowly in the late light. That night, he found himself turning the charm over in his hands while the fire in his hearth burned low. Its beadwork caught the flames, the same blue as the bead he'd found in the river shallows. He kept it on the mantel, telling himself it was simply respect for a gift, though the truth ran deeper. 3 days passed before he saw her again. This time, she came without escort, guiding a lean bay horse at an easy pace down the trail. A basket hung from her saddle, and when she reached the gate, she opened it without hesitation. "I bring food," she said, lifting the basket. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were flatbreads still warm, and a small pouch of dried berries. He stepped aside as she dismounted, watching her move with a grace that seemed practiced yet unstudied. She followed him to the barn, where he had been tending a horse with a strained leg. Without asking, she crouched beside the animal, speaking to it in low, rhythmic tones as she examined the swelling. Her fingers were sure and gentle. The horse stilled under her touch. "You've done this before," he said. She looked up, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. "Horses, no truth." It was the first time he'd seen her smile, and it struck him harder than he expected. They worked side by side in the easy silence of people who understood that not every moment required filling. Rain began to whisper against the roof, then deepened to a steady drumming. She glanced toward the open barn doors, then back at him. "We wait?" He nodded. The scent of rain and hay thickened in the air. They stood near the doorway, watching the silver threads fall across the yard. After a while, she asked, "Why you live alone?" He took a slow breath. "It's quieter that way." She tilted her head, studying him as if weighing the truth in that answer. "Quiet, sometimes heavy." Her words hung there, simple but sharp. He didn't answer, but he knew she was right. The quiet had grown heavier than he'd realized until she'd stepped into it. When the rain eased, she gathered her things, but not before looking once more at the land stretching outward from his door. "Your place strong," she said. It was as close to praise as he'd heard from anyone in a long time. The days that followed brought a rhythm he hadn't expected. She came once with herbs for his horse, another time with carved wooden spoons she said were for cooking. Each time, they shared a little more, scraps of her language mixed with his, laughter at their own stumbles. She spoke of her people's ways, the winter gatherings by the river, the songs that were not sung in the presence of strangers. He listened, not to learn but to understand. One evening, as the sun fell low, she spoke more quietly. "My family want me to marry soon. For tribe's good." He didn't move. "And what do you want?" She was silent for a moment, her gaze on the horizon where the light was bleeding into the hills. "I want a man who see me. Not only what I can give." Something in the steadiness of her tone made his chest tighten. She looked at him then, as if to measure whether he understood the weight of her words. He did, though he didn't say it aloud. They stood there until the shadows thickened, and she mounted her horse to leave. As she reached the gate, she turned in the saddle. "Maybe I tell them," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach him. "Tell them what?" Her smile was small but certain. "That I already choose." The hoofbeats faded into the dusk, leaving the yard steeped in a deeper kind of quiet, one that no longer felt empty but waiting. She came at dawn 2 days later, the mist still clinging low over the grass, her figure breaking through it like a memory returning before it was ready. He had been splitting kindling, the axe biting into the block with the steady rhythm of habit, when the faint creak of leather and the slow crunch of hooves reached him. She dismounted without a word, leading her horse to the rail as though she had always belonged in this yard. In her hand she carried a small pouch, the drawstring knotted with care. She offered it to him with a faint incline of her head. Inside were herbs, their scent sharp and clean, a mix he recognized for treating fevers. "For you," she said, and then, after a pause, "and your horse." He took it, feeling the softness of the dried leaves under his fingertips. "I'm not sick." Her eyes held his steady. "But maybe one day." It was not an offer born of politeness but of a deeper sense, the kind that prepared before the need came. The day held the weight of rain, clouds low and restless. She followed him to the corral, where the injured bay was limping less than before. They worked side by side without needing to explain the steps, cleaning the hoof, checking the swelling. He noticed how her hands moved with a certain patience, as if every touch was a conversation with the animal rather than a task to be done. The rain finally broke, drumming hard against the roof of the barn. They stayed inside, the air close with the scent of hay and earth. She wandered along the shelves, running her fingers over old tools and jars. "You live here long?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. "Alone all that time?" He nodded. "Easier that way." She looked at him, not with pity but with a kind of recognition. "Easier, but not better." The words landed deeper than he wanted to admit. She turned away, studying the rain as it carved silver threads down the open doorway. Her hair had come loose, strands curling damp against her cheeks. They spoke of smaller things after that, the stubbornness of horses, the way the river's current could change without warning. She told him about gathering plants in the high meadows as a girl, how her grandmother taught her to tell the difference between roots that healed and roots that poisoned. Her voice softened when she spoke of her grandmother, as though those lessons still lived in her hands. When the rain eased, they stepped outside. The ground was dark and rich with the scent of water, the sky split between storm and sunlight. She lingered by her horse, not mounting yet. "My people asked me again," she said, her tone different now, heavier. "They want me to choose a husband." He leaned against the rail, keeping his voice even. "And what did you tell them?" "That I will choose when I find one worth choosing." She glanced at him, a flicker of defiance in her eyes, though it wasn't aimed at him. "They think choice is small. But it is big." He didn't answer right away. There were things in her voice he recognized, the quiet fight to keep something of herself in a world that would take what it could. "You deserve a man who sees you," he said finally. "Not just what you can bring to his life." Her gaze stayed on him a moment longer than the words required. She seemed to turn them over in her mind, as if testing their weight. Then she mounted her horse, settling the reins loosely in her hands. "Maybe. I already see one." Before he could respond, she was riding away, her figure shrinking against the pale horizon. The days that followed were thick with thoughts he didn't name. He worked the land, fixed the fence along the east field, patched the roof of the shed, all the while hearing her voice in his mind, each word deliberate and unhurried. At night, he found himself watching the beadwork charm on the mantel, the blue and white pattern catching the firelight as if it held a secret. On the 5th day, she returned. This time, her arrival was different, no slow ease through the gate, no small gift in her hands. She came with purpose, her horse carrying her fast down the trail, the air behind her stirred with the urgency of motion. She dismounted quickly, her breath quickened from the ride. "There will be gathering," she said, the word sharp with intent. "Many people. Elders." He set down the tool he'd been holding. "For what?" "For choosing. My choosing." Her eyes did not waver. "I want you there." The request caught him off guard. "Why me?" Her mouth curved, not into a smile but into something more resolute. "Because they must see. See the one I may choose." He felt the ground shift under those words. "This isn't something to do lightly," he said. "I do nothing lightly," she answered. There was no heat in it, only truth. For a moment, they stood in the stillness between storms, the air carrying the faint tang of rain yet to fall. He could see she had already made some kind of decision, though whether it was final or only forming, he couldn't tell. "I'll come," he said at last. She nodded, as though she had expected no other answer. Her gaze lingered on him a moment longer, then she mounted her horse. "It is tomorrow. At the river." As she turned to leave, the wind lifted the edges of her dress, the beadwork catching the pale sun. He watched her ride away, feeling the weight of what tomorrow might bring settle over him like the first cold wind of autumn, sharp, inevitable, and carrying change. The morning came pale and still, the kind of quiet that felt like the land was holding its breath. He saddled his horse without haste, though the knot in his chest pulled tighter with each strap cinched. The ride to the river took him through country washed clean by the night's rain, the earth dark and smelling of sage. Mist clung low along the water, curling upward in thin threads that caught the early light. When he reached the bend where the current slowed, they were already gathered. Dozens of figures stood in a wide half-circle, their clothes bright with beadwork and fringed leather, the colors made richer by the damp air. Elders sat on carved stools, their faces carved deeper still by years of wind and sun. The smell of wood smoke drifted from a small fire at the center, its flames steady despite the breeze. She was there, standing just beyond the fire. The river light played across her hair, and her dress was different, darker, the beadwork heavier, as if each stitch carried meaning. Her gaze found him at once. There was no shyness in it, no uncertainty, only the calm of someone who had already walked the length of their decision. A young man stepped forward from the crowd, tall and lean, his braids bound in red cloth. He looked at her first, then at the cowboy, his eyes narrowing with unspoken challenge. A murmur ran through those gathered, but she raised her hand slightly, stilling it. An elder began to speak, his voice low and steady, carrying the rhythm of tradition. Though the words were not his language, the cowboy understood the shape of the moment. This was the choosing, the formal claim of one life to another. When the elder finished, the young man in red cloth stepped closer to her, speaking in a quick rush that needed no translation, an appeal, an assertion. She listened without changing her expression, then shook her head once. The young man's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. It was then that she turned toward the cowboy and walked across the space between them. Her steps were unhurried, each one in answer to whatever question the crowd had carried here. She stopped before him, so close he could see the faint shimmer of water still in her hair from some ritual washing. Her voice was clear, carrying over the hush. "I choose you." The words settled over him like the sudden stilling of wind. For a heartbeat he said nothing. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, the heat of the fire, the cool touch of mist against his neck. He searched her face, not for doubt, because there was none, but for the reason she had carried this choice to him. "Why?" he asked quietly, knowing she would hear. Her eyes did not waver. "Because you saw me when I was not strong. And you did not take anything for it." The answer was so simple it shook him. He thought of all the moments since the river, the way she had stood in his yard without asking to be invited, the quiet understanding in her questions, the way she had moved through his solitude like it belonged to her as much as it did to him. He nodded slowly. "If that's your choice," he said, his voice carrying enough for the elders to hear, "I'll honor it." There was a ripple through the crowd, some soft, approving sounds, others sharper, the low murmur of discontent. The elder nearest the fire rose, speaking again in the slow cadence of authority. The cowboy caught only fragments in translation, a joining not just of two people, but of two ways of living, a bridge built without warning. The young man in red cloth stepped forward once more, this time toward the cowboy. His voice was quiet but edged. Though the words were foreign, the meaning was clear enough. He questioned his worth, his place here. The cowboy met his gaze without raising his own voice. "I didn't ask her to choose me. But I won't turn from it now." The elder lifted a hand, ending whatever might have followed. The crowd began to shift, some dispersing toward the edge of the clearing, others drawing closer to speak in low tones. She remained beside him, her presence steady as stone. A woman came forward with a folded cloth, placing it into her hands. She unfolded it to reveal a length of leather, soft and worn, with beadwork at each end. Without a word, she draped it over his palm, closing his fingers around it. "It means you come back," she said. He studied the leather, the faint warmth where her hands had been. "And if I don't?" She met his question with the faintest curve of a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Then you leave something unfinished." The gathering began to thin, the fire's smoke trailing toward the river. He felt the pull of his horse wading upriver, the long ride back through the misted hills. But her gaze held him there, as if the leaving was not yet allowed. "Tomorrow," she said, almost in a whisper meant only for him, "they will light the wedding fire." He let the words settle, the weight of them drawing the edges of the world a little closer. Tomorrow, then. When he turned toward his horse, the mist had thickened along the bend, swallowing the far shore. Behind him, the fire still burned, and her figure stood beside it, unmoving, watching him until the trees closed between them. The wedding fire was already burning when he reached the clearing, its flames tall and restless in the pre-dawn wind. The light spilled over faces gathered in a wide ring, shadows stretching long across the trampled grass. Drums throbbed in a slow, steady beat, each strike echoing like the measured pulse of the earth. The air was heavy with the scent of pine resin and smoke, undercut by the sharper tang of fresh-cut cedar laid around the blaze. She stood near the center, her hair braided with thin strips of white cloth that caught the firelight with every shift of her head. The dress she wore was lighter now, stitched with new beadwork that glimmered in motion, blues and silvers that suggested river water breaking under sunlight. She did not turn to find him, though he knew she was aware the moment he stepped from the shadows. The elder from the day before stepped forward, his voice rising above the drumbeats. The words rolled like a low river, carrying meanings the cowboy only half grasped but felt in his bones. Around the circle, the people listened in a stillness that belonged to more than the hour. It was the kind of quiet given to moments when the past and future seemed to lean toward each other. She moved toward him when the elder's voice faded, stopping just close enough for the heat of the fire to press against them both. Her eyes searched his face for something, not doubt, but perhaps the proof that he had come willing. He gave a small nod, and that seemed to be enough. A woman approached carrying two shallow bowls, one steaming with a dark, fragrant liquid, the other filled with river water. The elder dipped his hands into each in turn, murmuring words that sounded older than any name here, then motioned for them to join hands. Her fingers slid into his without hesitation, warm and steady. He caught the faint rise of her pulse where their wrists touched. Her gaze stayed on him as the elder poured the river water over their clasped hands, the cool shock drawing a shiver up his arm. Then came the heat, a smear of the dark liquid over their joined skin, sharp-scented with herbs he didn't know. A murmur ran through the crowd, the sound swelling like a tide. When the elder stepped back, she lifted their joined hands and said, in the language they shared, "Now you walk where I walk." For the first time since he had met her, he felt the weight of what she was giving him, not only herself, but her people, her history, the narrow bridge between two worlds that were not meant to meet. He wanted to say something that carried the same weight, but the words felt too small. Before he could try, a sharp voice cut through the murmurs. It came from the young man in red cloth, who had stepped forward until the fire lit the hard lines of his face. His words tumbled fast and heated, his hands slicing the air toward the cowboy. Others nodded sharply, some frowning, a few turning away. The elder answered with a measured tone, but the young man shook his head, his eyes never leaving the cowboy. There was no need for translation, the challenge was plain. She let go of the cowboy's hand and turned to face the young man, her voice firm and low. Whatever she said drew a fresh wave of murmurs, but it did not ease the tightness in the young man's jaw. The cowboy stepped forward then, closing the space between them. "If you think I came to take what isn't freely given, you're wrong," he said evenly. "But if you think I'll step away from her now, you're wrong about that too." The young man's stare held a flicker of something, anger yes, but also something like grief. Then he turned sharply and moved to the edge of the crowd, disappearing into the shadows beyond the fire's reach. The drum started again, slower this time, almost mournful. The elder motioned for them to circle the fire together. She took his arm, her touch light but certain. As they walked, the crowd began to follow, the rhythm of feet joining the drum's beat until it became one sound, one motion. The heat from the flames brushed against his face at every turn, mingling with the cooler breath of the wind that swept off the river. He caught glimpses of her profile in the shifting light, the set of her jaw, the quiet determination in her gaze. When they stopped, the elder placed a carved wooden pendant into his hands, a small bird in flight. "For safe return," the elder said in accented English, the first he had spoken in the cowboy's hearing. She looked at the pendant, then at him. "You keep it near. Always." The drums faded, and the people began to drift back toward the river bank, where smaller fires burned and food waited. The air smelled of roasted corn and wild onions, the easy hum of voices replacing the ceremony's taut silence. He felt her hand slip from his arm. When he turned, she was speaking with an older woman, their voices low, the firelight soft on their faces. She smiled faintly at something the woman said, but it didn't last. Her gaze flicked toward the dark line of trees where the young man had gone, and the smile fell away. When she returned to him, Her voice was quieter than before. He won't let it go. He nodded, the truth of it already lodged in his gut. Then we'll be ready for when he tries. Her eyes searched his face again, as if weighing whether he understood the shape of what lay ahead. Finally she said, It won't be with words. The fire crackled between them, throwing sparks into the wind. Somewhere beyond the trees, a single drumbeat sounded, not part of the ceremony, but something separate, deliberate. It came again, slower, like a warning carried across distance. She glanced toward the sound, then back at him. It started.